It would seem that getting inside a combat vehicle and carrying a water flask is a simple task even for the most ordinary soldier. But as it turns out, even here there's a place for army trickery, which has been used by Russian soldiers for decades. Why do they sit on a roof of BTRs or BMPs while moving, and not inside the vehicle? And why do Russian soldiers squash their flasks on purpose? So, I think each of us at least once saw a photo which shows about a dozen soldiers sitting on top of armored vehicles. What's more, it could be both pictures taken nowadays and back in the times of the war in Chechnya or Afghanistan. Why do they do this? A thing to keep in mind: Soviet light armored vehicles can only resist the fire of light firearms, pistols, rifles, or machine guns like PKM or M240. What's more, as far as rifles and machine guns are concerned, only if they are loaded with simple army rounds, and not, for instance, armor-piercing ones. These vehicles cannot protect you from anything that has a larger caliber, like M2, Deshka or NSV machine guns, not to speak about grenade launchers. But hey, inside the BTR, MTLB or BRDM there's at least some armor, and outside soldiers are not even protected from a rifle bullet. What's the point here then? Firstly, it helps soldiers leave the vehicle faster in case of a fire contact. They can just jump off, which is way faster than getting out through the small troop compartment doors. The second advantage is that being seated on top, soldiers can maintain a 360-degree view by dividing their sectors of vision. This makes it easier for the unit to spot an enemy or a mine in the path of the convoy. The third reason became particularly acute during the war in Chechnya. The supply of troops had traditionally been a weak link since the Soviet army, but in Chechnya, the constant ambushes and guerrilla attacks aggravated this problem even more. In such a situation, light vehicles became a real salvation. Russian soldiers began stuffing BTRs, BMPs, and MTLBs with food, clothing, and ammunition. In addition to food, they carried the wounded inside, who could occupy 3 passenger seats. Therefore, soldiers had no choice but to occupy space on the roof of the vehicles. Another reason was mines. Soviet AFVs are unable to protect soldiers from mines. Because of its weak armor, Russian soldiers even nicknamed the infantry fighting vehicle, BMP, the infantry mass grave. However, if a soldier sits on top of a light vehicle, it will give at least some chance of surviving an IED or mine explosion. Interestingly, this practice was also present in the United States Army up until the Vietnam War. However, nothing of this kind happens today. There is simply no point. And what about the flasks? Why do Russian soldiers squash them? At first glance, it may seem that those flasks look like this just because they are made of aluminum and have been in use for a long time. But this was the case only in times of the World War II. Back then, Wehrmacht soldiers carried their flasks in thick pouches, which protected them from deformation. The Red Army, on the other hand, had thin pouches, and the flasks soon lost their shape. In the modern army, Russian soldiers squash their flasks on purpose. The reason is quite simple. Most commanders make their soldiers keep their flasks filled to the brim at all times. But carrying that heavy stuff in an already impractical belt is not exactly pleasant. That's why they came up with some trickery. They crumple the flask so that the volume of water carried is smaller, and thanks to the fabric cover, the checking commander will not notice the dents. However, this was only done in military units that were far from combat operations. It is also funny how they returned the flask to its shape. In winter, it was the easiest. A soldier simply filled the flask with water and left it in the cold. After a couple hours, the dents would straighten out. Some sprayed it with a fire extinguisher. However, it is unknown how they then took responsibility for the opened fire extinguisher. But the most interesting way was when the soldiers fired blank cartridges directly into the flask. One shot from the AK allowed to get rid of all the dents at once. However, it could fly off the barrel of the rifle like a rifle grenade, and then they had to search for it for a very long time. That's all for today. Thank you guys for watching. This was Casper, and I'll see you next week.